House from Baghdad to New Orleans, Sordid Secrets and Strange Tales of White House Gone Wild. Greg Palast joins us in the studio now. Greg, I just want to start where you left off and started this film, A Few Good Men. I don't think most people understand this about David Iglesias.
Yes, well, Inglesias was the guy played by Tom Cruise in the film A Few Good Men, which is a real story about how a young military attorney stood up to the military brass to uncover the truth. And somehow they thought that this
was a hazing of a young man, a soldier who
was killed, and it was covered up. And, he just wanted to get to the truth. That was David Iglesias. And now here he is again, standing up to the brass. I mean, one of the things we have to be very careful of is, I'm not going to say he's a man for all season. He went along just before the 2004 election and held a big splashy press conference saying, yes, I'm going to go and look for voter fraud, that there are, looks like there may be thousands of fraudulent voters. Understand what this is about. This is to create a hysteria so they could pass legislation which would require voters to show up with ID. 250,000 voters were turned away for having the wrong ID, but no one was arrested. So Karl Rove and his assistant, Tim Griffin, are in a panic. You're turning away thousands of voters, you're not arresting any. So he's asking Inglesias, demanding Inglesias, and now we know a half dozen others, almost everyone that was fired. They demand that they just grab people. That's where Inglesias drew the line in the sand. He said a press conference is one thing, which he probably shouldn't have done. But literally handcuffing innocent voters for show trials, and then, of course, then he dropped the case later, that is one thing he absolutely was not going to do. He was going to give up his job. He also made the mistake. When he got calls from Senator Pete Domenici asking for inside information, pushing him to arrest Democrats a week before the midterm election of 2006, that was another attempt at what could be obstruction of justice. The U.S. Code for U.S. attorneys requires that he turn in Senator Domenici, which he admits he didn't do, and now he regrets that, but he said, I want the evidence out there anyway, even if it shows that I failed to act.
And Heather Wilson, of course, also called, and Heather Wilson at the time in an extremely close race for her political life as a Congress member from New Mexico.
Well, in fact, from my investigation, she didn't win. There was voter fraud, and that the majority of the votes went to the Democrats. Another thing is that Iglesias did not, unfortunately, investigate the other side of the coin, which is this massive denial of votes, systematic by the Republican operatives. Now, what we have and what we showed in the film is that when I was investigating for BBC and for Democracy Now! Back in 2004, we got 500 of the so-called missing emails of Karl Rove. They were, Karl Rove, people think he's an evil genius, but that's only about half right. I mean, he's not necessarily the sharpest knife in the drawer, and he and his guys were mistyping their email addresses, sent them to georgewbush.org instead of .com, which is an email domain owned by friends of ours who shot them right to us. We went through the 500, and what we found were this massive plan to deny the right to vote, extraordinarily targeting African-American soldiers sent overseas. They'd send them a letter to their home address, the letter would come back, they say, gee, they don't live there, they shouldn't be allowed to vote. Their absentee ballot would come in from overseas and it would be challenged, they'd lose their vote, they wouldn't even know it. Now, when we showed this to several voting rights attorneys, including, as you heard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now he was really shaken up. That's when he said, these guys should be in jail. So this is the other side of this whole issue involving the prosecutors. And who did this? Who was in charge of this? It wasn't Rove personally. He'd put Tim Griffin in charge. Griffin is the guy who, with Rove, picked out the U.S. attorneys to be fired and then had himself named by Rove to the spot as U.S. Attorney for Arkansas. So what we may have here is a case of the perpetrator of voter fraud becoming the prosecutor. I mean, it is, and what this is all about, in fact, I have an internal Tim Griffin email. What this is all about is he says it's all about the votes. This is about the 2008 election, a panic to get their people in place for 2008 to create hysteria about voter ID, knock out minority voters, especially Hispanics, and to put in their people who are experienced in knocking out voters.
I want to go more into this after break. We're talking to Greg Palast. His book just came out in paperback. It's called Our Madhouse, From Baghdad to New Orleans. Stay with us.
big away can. Man, take a street shooter, just run away. Careful how you vote on election day. Lord, why did he go far? God knows he might never stop. But all right, there.
Careful how you vote. Sunnyland Slim here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're talking to Greg Palast, investigative journalist, author of Armed Madhouse, From Baghdad to New Orleans. Investigative journalist Murray Wass reported last week the Bush administration has withheld emails showing senior White House and Justice Department officials collaborated to conceal the role of White House strategist Karl Rove in installing his former deputy, Timothy Griffin, as U.S. Attorney in Arkansas. The email showed that Attorney General Alberto Gonzales' former chief of staff, DeKal Sampson, worked with White House officials on 2 letters that misled Congress on the appointment and also Rove's role in that. Greg.
Well, yeah, they were covering up the fact that Tim Griffin, who's Rove's right-hand man, and you have to understand, Rove is the political director at the White House, was deeply involved in targeting and taking out the U.S. attorneys who were recalcitrant and wouldn't start handcuffing Hispanic voters on false voter charges. They also know it's a slippery slope, because they know that I have 500 of the so-called missing emails, and in fact, that's one of the points that in one of their internal emails, which was actually subpoenaed by the committee, they're complaining about that guy, the British reporter. That's Greg Palast. As you realize, Amy, I'm American. But of course, my reports are exiled to BBC Britain, and then they come back here through Democracy Now!, bless you. But they're saying that these reports about Griffin's role have not been picked up in the U.S. media, in the U.S. national media. And they're kind of right. I mean, this material has not come through the U.S. media. They don't want Griffin roles opened up, because once they have the role of Griffin in the firings opened up, they'll ask why that happened. They will find and discover these emails, and in fact, now that they're public, we'll turn them over to the Conyers Committee, and then they'll find out that Griffin was deeply involved in the removal of legal voters. And now you're getting into potential felony area. That's a very serious business. So they want to stop the slippery slope of bringing in Griffin and revealing the entire chain of emails, not just his involvement in the firings, but what led up to it. And that brings us to the emails that you just saw on our report.
In this whole scandal, we keep hearing about voter fraud. But can you explain what is being talked about here with this aggressive effort to restrict particularly people of color voting in battleground states?
What happened is that the Republican Party was running a massive campaign directed by Karl Rove, and we know Tim Griffin from the written emails, to block voters' votes or to challenge their votes. One way to challenge voters was to say that they were stealing someone else's identity. Someone is voting for Amy Goodman. Well, they say the solution is to create ID cards. The problem is we can't find anyone anywhere who's committed this crime of stealing Amy Goodman's name to vote. People are not willing to go to jail to vote in some school board election or even for the presidency. What Griffin, Rove's assistant,